And Uriah says, I'm supposed to be in battle. I'm not going to do that because my men are in battle and I'm going to sleep in the gateway. I'm not going to go. And eventually he gets sent back to the battlefield, and David gives instructions to make sure he goes to the heart of the battle so that he's killed. That's pretty brutal. I mean, that's more soap opera than soap opera. Yeah? And it's quite interesting that when we had a Bible study at Stone Church for a number of years that was with people who live on or near the street. And it was this kind of stuff that they loved. Because it was like the soaps they were watching on the TV. They'd really get into this. Genesis and Judges and all that. That's it. I mean, it was a brilliant Bible study because they were right there. And they'd say, oh, that's just like such and such. That's just like, I don't know, whatever the soap operas are nowadays. Coronation Street or whatever they were watching. It's just like Coronation Street. It's just a soap opera, really. But David is brutal. And you'll notice that there are all those crowns and daggers and things on the end there. It's all to do with him making sure that he maintains his rule. But David is a unique king. And this is why David is anointed, and God says that David is a man after his own heart. And this is why. This is his, well, anyone tell me why David is a unique king? He does something that no other king does. All the other kings of Israel and of Judah, or of the combined kingdom of Israel and Judah, all fail on one thing. Right. David never worships a foreign god. Everybody else worships a foreign god. But David never worships a foreign god. He worships God, and God alone. And that is why he's held in such high esteem. That is the point. And so David wants to build a temple. If you turn over the page. David wants to build a temple. Oh, that's interesting. What happened there? There. So David wants to build a temple. But he's not allowed to build the temple. Why not? Does anyone know? Because he's a man of blood. He's a man of blood. He shed too much blood. I don't quite know why Solomon's therefore allowed to build the temple, but we won't go because he sheds pretty big amounts of blood too. But anyway, that's the reason given. He's a man of blood. He's not allowed to build the temple. So he wants to build the temple, but the other thing that David does is he rescues the Ark of the Covenant, and then brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem because he actually captures the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem wasn't part of the deal until David. And David captures the city of Jerusalem and brings the Ark of the Covenant in. And what does he do when he's coming in with the Ark of the Covenant? Dances and sings naked before the Lord. And his wife Michal looks out of the window and she says, man, you shouldn't be doing that. Cover yourself up. And, pardon? Well, I know. But it was naked by their standards. And she says, you know, get yourself organized. Have you ever worn a loincloth? And well, if you're jumping up and down. But anyway, we won't go there. And so, consequently, what happens is that David brings the Ark of the Covenant in, and he wants to build a temple around the Ark, but he's still not allowed to. They still keep it in the original tabernacle. And then Solomon gets the job of building the temple. And you'll notice there's an outline of the temple. This is the first temple. Okay? How many temples are there in total? 3. This is the first one. Okay, this is pretty simple stuff, really. Basically, you have a porch, where people would gather. Notice the two little black dots at the bottom there? There? They're actually where you would purify yourself, wash yourself before you went. They would have been giant copper bowls that you could actually get into and have a good scrub. The porch is a gathering place. The holy place is where the sacrifices are made, generally speaking. And the Holy of Holies is where the annual sacrifice is made by the high priest once a year on behalf of the people for the forgiveness of sins. And of course, the story goes that the high priest had a rope tied around him when he went in. Why? He had a rope tied around his waist and you go into the Holy of Holies. Why do you have a rope? So if he got struck down, he could be dragged out because nobody else is going to want to go in and pick him up. And if he's got struck down, what's going to happen to the rest of us? And so that is it's a very simple version of the temple. However, notice what's in the bottom left-hand corner. What is that? Pardon? A labourer. Under a heavy load. Under Solomon. In fact, Solomon enslaved Jews for his building projects. So actually, within 1, 2, how many kings? 3, the Jews have become enslaved. Just as God said that, or some of them have. Now you may say, well, that's not so bad because actually they're building the temple. Well, fair enough, except that if you actually look at it, the big building project for Solomon wasn't the temple. He wouldn't have needed slave labor to do that. Anyone know what his big building project was? His palace, which was about 7 times the size of the temple. And that's what he needed the slave labor to do. And so Solomon eventually passes from the scene, and at this point, the kingdom is divided. And you'll notice in the map there, you've got Judah at the bottom and Israel at the top, sometimes known as the northern and southern kingdoms. Now, where's Jerusalem? But which one? It's in the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, right? Now these people are supposed to be one nation, worshipping one God in one place. If you're living in the northern kingdom, what's your problem? You've got to travel into the southern kingdom to worship. So therefore, when you read the book of Kings, you'll notice something quite outstanding, and that is this: Israel never has a good king. If you read it, it says, so Ahab, for example, was king of Israel and did evil in the sight of the Lord. So-and-so, Hazael, was king of Israel and did evil in the sight of the Lord. Right. And the reason that they did evil in the sight of the Lord was because, if you look, I mean, even if they didn't murder and kill and stuff like Ahab did, if you look, you've got Bethel and Dan. They're 2 shrines. That's what that sort of bird-like creature is supposed to signify. They're 2 shrines to worship God other than Jerusalem. And so if you're the king of that kingdom, you can't possibly do good in the eyes of the Lord because you're encouraging people to worship in a place that isn't Jerusalem. So you will always do evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now that's not to say that we don't find that the kings in the southern kingdom are perfect either. They're not. A lot of them do evil in the sight of the Lord as well. But the northern kings, no northern king does anything other than evil in the sight of the Lord. Now the flip side of this, of course, is you have to remember it's the southern kingdom who are writing the history. So, you know, that's, that's another part of it. But we'll take a break for lunch at this point, and we'll come back to the kings in a minute. Okay? Okay, could you turn to page 42, please? That means you're going to be skipping a couple of pages. We're going to go back in a second. Page 42 gives I've got it in two halves as it happens. On the right-hand side, which is what's up there now, you've got the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom. And you'll notice that the kingdom of Israel, underneath the different sections, there are different colors. And that's because each of those colors, so the green, the blue, the purple, the whatever color that is, sicky, yellowy color, they all represent dynasties. And so there's a break in dynasty every so often, and you'll notice that often comes about because somebody gets stabbed or killed by their successor. And then if you look on the other side, you will see that it's a straight line. There is no dynastic issue here. All those little lines is just to show the difference in the length of reigns. But you'll notice again, the little crosses there mean that the people weren't always happy. So they killed kings sometimes. And you'll also notice that, as I said before the break, none of the kings of Israel have a check mark. But notice also that not all the kings of Judah have a check mark either. Now, a check mark was a good king. Now, here's the really difficult question for everybody. There is one queen in there. One queen. Anyone know who she is?
The one with the 2 X's?
Pretty, yes, very good, yes. Athaliah, who actually transferred across from one side to the other. And she was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. So what a great provenance she had. And so she is the only queen. So that just gives you an idea, and you can notice that the two kingdoms fall at different times. The northern kingdom falls about 100 years before the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, they're taken off by the Assyrians, and the kingdom of Israel ends, and the southern kingdom, they're taken off by the Babylonians, and then that's the end of the southern kingdom. If you turn back one page, I just very briefly want to touch on this. I've got to go back in order to get back. Ding, 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 ding. This is an important, if you just look at your King's chart for a second, you'll notice about fifth from the bottom is Josiah. And Josiah is the last good king. Okay? Josiah, like most of his predecessors, was an idol worshipper up until a point, and then he turned around. His father, Ammon, if you notice, was assassinated. That's because he was such an evil, evil king. And the one before him, Manasseh, wasn't much better. So Josiah comes in and discovers that God is different. And the way he discovers it, amongst other things, is, you'll notice there on page 40, there's a picture of the temple, and then there's this big red arrow and some scrolls, and it's the book of the law. What happened was, or this is what we think happened, we actually don't think that there was a book of the law in the temple for quite a long time before Josiah reigned. And there certainly wasn't a book of the law in the temple prior to Josiah's reign. Josiah then begins to worship Yahweh and orders the restoration of the internal part of the temple. And what the Bible tells us is when they were tearing down walls inside the temple, they discovered a book of the law. And it led to Josiah reinstituting a lot of the stuff that used to happen. So the big question that scholars have, and this is only a theory, but it explains why we've got that big red arrow with coming down, is the theory is, because people have always said, well, what happened to that book of the, how did that book of the law get to be there? Well, if you turn ahead one page again, you'll notice that Josiah is king quite a long time after the fall of the northern kingdom. And what the theory is that they think that what happened was that somehow a remnant of Yahweh worshippers in the north had a book of the law. When they were taken over by the Assyrians, they think that what happened was they brought it down to the temple and hid it in the temple. And then it was discovered during the reign of Josiah. And Josiah introduced all kinds of reforms. You'll notice on his on the map there that you've got, cattle and sort of funny-looking coke things, fires are all crossed out, and that's because Josiah destroyed all the Baal worship sites, and it was one God to be worshipped in one place again. Of course, the northern kingdom are pretty well gone, but Josiah destroyed all of that. But you'll also notice that right in the bottom left-hand corner, the Egyptians come in. And that's the end of Josiah, because he gets killed in battle with the Egyptians. And so that is him. And then if you go back to your family tree, there's another 4 kings, all of whom aren't too great. And eventually we get to the Babylon issue. So if you'll turn over the page to page 44, you'll notice that the way our Bible is set up is it's set up so that you have the history, which runs to Ezra and Nehemiah. So starting with Genesis, it goes all the way through to Ezra and Nehemiah. And then we start with the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all that lot. You have to remember that rather than them historically sitting like that, they actually sit like that. In other words, the stuff that's been spoken about in the prophets is what's happening in the history. The prophets are actually speaking at the same time as the history is happening, particularly the end bits around the kings. Yeah? Not so much the early stuff. And then also, after the Jews returned from Israel, prophets like Haggai, etc., are prophets who speak after the Jews return from exile. So the prophets are speaking into the messy politics of the Jews. And they're saying, remember, we've got to go right the way back now to point number 6 on the covenant. What was point number 6 on the covenant? Can anyone remember? The blessings and the curses. If you keep this covenant, this will happen, and you will live long in the land. But if you don't keep this covenant, God's going to get you, basically. And that's what the prophets say. The prophets basically, you see, we tend to think, well, I'll ask you a question. What is a prophet's main role in life? Right, to speak the word of God. It is not to foretell the future. People think that a prophetic voice is... Now, do prophets foretell the future? Yes. But the majority of their writings are actually about, this is what God says, and if you don't do it, this is what's going to happen. But their primary purpose and role of a prophet is to call the people of God back to the Word of God. That's actually the primary role of a prophet. And so what we have here is this picture of the kingdom disintegrating. So you've got your 2 kingdoms, and you'll notice at the top of this page, you've got a guy with an ice cream on his head. Or at least it looks like he's got an ice cream on his head. And that is the king of the Assyrians. So what happened first of all is the Assyrians come in and they take the northern kingdom into exile. Now they're a pretty nasty bunch of people, the Assyrians. They took people into exile by putting a fish hook through their nose. and then putting a piece of twine through the fish hook and then attaching you by a fish hook to the person who was walking behind you. That made you kept up. And you also didn't walk too fast. And that was, so the Assyrians are not nice people. And they're the first people to come in. And they take all of the, well, they don't take everybody. They take the elite, the ruling class, back to Nineveh. And it's important to remember that. It's the ruling class they take back to Nineveh, not everybody. So the peasants and so forth stay in the land. All throughout all this time, the prophets have been warning. If you don't keep the law, if you keep breaking it, you see the tablets broken behind the prophet? If you keep breaking it, this is going to go badly for you. Now, actually, there were only 2 prophets who spoke to the kingdom of Israel. Anyone know who they were? Of all the prophets we have in the Bible, only 2 of them were prophets to the northern kingdom. Hosea and Amos. And Amos was actually from the southern kingdom. And he went up to the northern kingdom and told them, this is this. And so it's a bit like somebody coming from Ontario and telling us what to do. You know, you'd get a really good reaction. Well, it's the same idea. So this guy from the southern kingdom goes to the northern kingdom and says, do this. You're not, so that's, and the northern kingdom then goes off into exile. All the other prophets, Isaiah, etc., Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all of those guys, they're all prophets to the southern kingdom. But again, the thing is the same. You're breaking the law. If you don't stop breaking the law, you're going to get got. And eventually, the Babylonians, first of all, they come and nearly take the place over, but then they go back. And then about 10 years later, they come and take it finally. And they destroy the temple. And again, they take the elite off into exile. Not quite as brutally as the Assyrians did. But so, anybody know the names of any of those elite who were taken off into exile in Babylon? Daniel. So that opens the door to the other 3. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Yeah? So these guys are all taken off again into exile. Now, this is strange, isn't it? Why is it, do you think, that both the Assyrians and the Babylonians, remember the Babylonians beat the Assyrians eventually, why do you think they take off just the elite? Not everybody.
They take the leadership.
They take the leadership. And what they do is they bring in another leadership from somewhere else in the empire. So they switch elites, it was their methodology. They would switch elites. So if you remember, sorry?
Cut off the head.
Cut off the head, exactly. If you remember, when Daniel and the boys are in Babylon, they're going to be being trained, it says, to be leaders by the Babylonians. And they refuse to eat meat because it's sacrificed to idols, and they only eat vegetables, and everybody gets upset, and so on and so forth. They're going to be trained, actually, to be what are known as satraps. The Babylonian Empire ran on the basis of satraps, which was like a governor. And so that's the methodology here. Now notice in the bottom corner, you've also got Egypt. And Egypt is also strong at this point as well. So that constantly these empires are clashing together and Israel's in the middle. And at the very end, the prophet everybody's taken off into exile. And if you read the very end of the prophet Jeremiah, it says, and Jeremiah went into exile in Egypt. So Jeremiah just kind of saunters off the stage. We never hear any more about it. Just disappears into Egypt. So that's the prophets. If you turn over the page, these are the sins. Now these are the sins of the individual and not of the nation. We'll come to those in a minute. But notice what's God's position up in the top. What is he doing? He's sitting in judgment. And these are the sins. And if you read the prophets, you'll find all of these mentioned time after time after time. First of all, the wealthy spend most of their time getting drunk and exploiting the people. So they're not in any way being charitable or helpful. They're spending their time. See, that guy's so drunk he can't even keep his wine in his cup there. It's falling out. Yeah. Now the lady, believe it or not, it is a lady. It looks like a man, doesn't it? But next to the guy with the cup, she is extremely wealthy. We can tell that she's extremely wealthy. Why? By her jewelry, and particularly the veil, because that would be her dowry for marriage. And so the more of the veil that more coins that you have on the veil, the more value you are for marriage. And again, wealthy women were criticized by the prophets, the cows of Bashan, for example. Just an interesting aside, of course, where do we find in Jesus' stories a story about coins? The woman who lost the coin, and she tears the house apart. Seems a bit strange that she'd tear a house apart for a coin, except when you realize it's her value from her dowry. And that's why she's so keen to find it. Because even several hundred years later, it was still the methodology to give the woman her value through the coins on her veil. They've ignored the law. Notice the scrolls are all grown over. What were they supposed to do with those scrolls? They were supposed to read the law all the time. And they've obviously broken the covenant. They're interested only in money. Even the prophets, there are paid prophets. I mean, the prophets that we have are the ones that actually were proved right. That's why we've got them. There were all hordes of prophets out there, schools of prophets and so forth, but they just wanted money. And they're criticized by the other prophets. Also, they're dishonest. The poor are exploited. They fix the scales. When you go buy stuff, they fix the scales so that you get either lightweight or they put extra stuff in that's not real and all this kind of stuff. There's dishonest dealing. And finally, only the rich get justice because the poor can't afford to pay for it. Yeah. So those are the individual sins. If we turn over the page, the nation also sins. The nation also sins. They trust in fortresses and weapons rather than in God. They keep making the dove down there is on the right-hand side, left-hand side, is because they constantly make alliances with other nations. They flutter from one nation to another. And the Lord said, don't make alliances, don't rely on other people, rely on me. But they're constantly fluttering around and they're going to get caught like a dove in a net, it says. And also, God is the leopard who is going to ultimately get them. He'll stalk them like a leopard and deal with them. They live in their fine houses with their vineyards and their palm trees, but the poor suffer. God is going to tear down those fine houses. In fact, what it says is, for their sins as a nation, he's going to turn, if you look at the bottom of the page, he's going to turn them into what? Rubble. The nation will be destroyed. It will be wiped off the face of the planet. That's what the prophets say, which is a pretty happy prospect, isn't it? Not at all nice. If you turn over the page. So they get sent, oops, where did we go? There, that looks right. So they get taken into exile, as we've seen. The temple is smashed. The king is gone. God is the king. He seems to have gone. What's this all about? This is the low point of Judaism. This is the lowest point. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept. How can we worship God in a strange land? You see, there was a belief in those days that, and this informs all that's happening, it's the backstory. First of all, although the Jews were kind of monotheistic, they weren't really. They thought their God was the top God, but they still believed there were all kinds of other gods. And what people believed in those days was that a god was a god of a particular territory. And if there was a battle between two nations, the battle didn't just happen on earth, it happened in the heavenlies. And whoever won the battle was the strongest god. So what does that tell us about the nature of Yahweh? They've been claiming that God, their God, is the greatest God, and now he's been beaten by Marduk, the god of the Babylonians. What does that say? He's not, is he the strongest God? I mean, he might be, but we don't get that. We don't understand that. How are we going to work this out? And how, the land, it was so important. He promised us the land. He said, this is the land that I will give you. He said, he promised Abraham, he said, this is the land, go into the land that I'll show you. You'll be a great nation, and now the land's gone. We don't even have the land, and here we are in exile. So we've lost the temple, we've lost our... What are we going to do? Can we even trust in God? Is God even possible? Do you see how desperate it would have been? But this is the time at which they begin to reflect on their history. This is the time when the Bible as we know it begins to be put together. The Old Testament. This is the time when they say, we have to put together all our written and oral traditions in order that we understand who we are. And maybe perhaps if we look at this really, really hard, we can understand what's happening here. We might just be, if we look at everything that we know about the way in which God has been, maybe, just maybe, we can begin to understand what God's doing. Maybe, just maybe, we might even be able to believe that there is a God that's concerned about us. And the second thing that happens is, look at the bottom left-hand corner, what's been smashed? The temple. So they've got no temple to worship in. So what we also think that this is when they start to worship in synagogues, whilst they're in exile in Babylon. They can't sacrifice, of course. And so there's this 70 years or so when they are really questioning who they are, what they are, and how things can be. Now, of course, there's faithful people. There's, well, Ezekiel goes off into exile, for example, with them. People like Daniel, people like Ezra and Nehemiah emerge. But it's, some people just never come home. Some people never come home. But there is a way home. And God gives them the way home. If you turn over the page. Now, it's not like the Exodus where seas are parted and stuff like that. There are, presumably, we think there are a number of returns. But the thing that happens is the Babylonians get defeated in war. We don't really know what happened. It just seems as though they disappeared. But who beat them? Anyone know? The Medes and the Persians. Now this is an interesting difference. The Babylonians, when they captured a territory, or the Assyrians, what did they do with the elite? They took them with them. Also, they destroyed their temples. The Medes and the Persians have a very different way of thinking about things. Number one, they actually believe that the elite of an area should be converted to their way of thinking and then actually rule the area that they come from. That's the first thing. And number two, the king of Persia doesn't want to upset any of the gods in any particular area. So actually he sees his job as restoring the temples of all the gods that his predecessors demolished. And so they send back the elite, and the king of Persia gives them all the gear and the passes and everything to go back and rebuild the temple. Very different method than the previous two. And the famous guys who go back, well, there are three waves, and probably people went in between these waves. The first two who go back are Jehu, the priest, and my favorite name in the whole of the Bible. I love saying this name. I always look forward to this part of this course because this is the name. I can now say this name, Zerubbabel. And so Zerubbabel and Jehu go back, and they begin the reconstruction of the temple. Now, there's a bit of an argument about what happens next. Either Nehemiah goes back and starts to rebuild the city, or Ezra goes back and starts to rebuild the law. And some people say it's the other way around. So some say Ezra went first and then Nehemiah, and some people say Nehemiah went first and then Ezra. Actually, it doesn't matter. They both went. But can anyone remember what Nehemiah's job was? Sorry?
Rebuild the wall.
To rebuild the wall. But when he was in exile, he had a job.
Oh, he was cupbearer, wasn't
Cupbearer to the king. Head of security. That's what Nehemiah's job was. He would have been the guy, if he'd been in these days, with the dark glasses and talking up his sleeve. And standing on the running board of the chariot as it went down the street. He was head of security. So actually it's a huge thing for the king to send his head of security back. And that's why he keeps insisting that he comes back. If you read it, you find. But Nehemiah is high up in the Persian structure. These Jews who were there, they were talented people. Ezra is the leading intellectual of his day for the Jews. He's the scribe among scribes. He knows the law inside out and back to front. These guys are not just little foolish people. These are important people who are leading the Jews back into their land. And of course, they don't only just send back stuff to build with, they also send back all the artifacts to the temple as well. All the gold and the silver and stuff that came out. He tells us that the Persian king gave all that. Cyrus gave all that to them to take back with them. Because what happened was the Babylonians would take everything out of their defeated nation's temples and set it up in their own temple in order that everybody knew that that temple, that god had been defeated. The Persians give it back to win favor with the gods of the territory that they've captured. It's a very different way of looking at things. And so the Jews get sent back. And in getting sent back, they've now got to try and stay home. And so they try and stay home. And so from the end of the book of Malachi, which is the end of the Old Testament, to the beginning of the book of Matthew, which is the beginning of the New Testament, how long? 400 years. It's another 400 years. And during this 400 years, from the end of that, Malachi is the prophet to the people returning from exile, to the beginning of Matthew, Judaism, pretty much like it is in Jesus' day, begins to form. But the key is that it's all made so that the Jews will never have to return to Babylon, even though Babylon's gone. In other words, they'll never lose the land. And so they begin by making sure that certain things happen. One of the things they do is they build a temple again. And they put God at the center. It takes them a long time to build a temple, about 60 years. They keep stopping. But they do build the temple. Also, what they've definitely got to do is they've got to, so you can see the temple in the middle. What they also have to do is they've got to make sure that people don't break the law. They've got to make sure that people don't break the law. So you'll notice there you've got two big tablets in the top corner and a number 613 in there. Anyone know what that's all about? Say again?
The number of sections of law?
Not the number of sections, but you're on the right lines. It's the rules that are put in place in addition to the law in order to stop you breaking the law. So in other words, they split out from the 10 big ones, the 10 commandments, and they produce 613 or 603 junior commandments to stop you breaking the big one. So for example, let's say the commandment that we want to stop someone breaking is, thou shalt not steal. What you then do is you build a whole bunch of rules around that commandment that will mean that you never, ever, ever get to the point where you can steal. So, you know, one of the rules might be you're not allowed to go into your neighbor's house without your neighbor being there. That could be a rule. So therefore, that's going to stop you from stealing from them. So they build a whole bunch of new rules around the Big Ten to kind of build a fence to stop you ever breaking the Big Ten. Why do they want you to stop you breaking the Big Ten? Because if you break the Big Ten, you might, the people might get taken out of the land again. That 613 becomes significant because it's the 613 rules that the Pharisees used in Jesus' day. In order, you had to obey all those rules if you were going to be a good Pharisee. So it's a huge change that happens there. Also, who's going to be the king? David's dynasty is at an end. Will God ever restore that dynasty? The people have to try and now put God as their king. So there they are, all happily dancing around the temple. Also, one of the other things they have to do is they have the law, but they also write down new interpretations of the law. These guys called the scribes write down new interpretations of the law in order to make sure that people aren't breaking it. And what happens is you start to get a situation where people will go to the scribes in order to get an interpretation. So that's why scribes are so important in Jesus' day, because they will go to, they're the ones who are interpreting the law. And also, there are some people, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, what's the picture that's in the bottom left-hand corner? What is that a picture of? The land. Israel. What's coming out from it? Right, waves, like circles, yeah? Some people said, we as Jews have a job to do, which is to spread the news of God to the Gentiles as well as keeping it to ourselves. All these texts in the prophets about people will come to Zion, to the mountain of the Lord to worship, they interpreted those as, we have a job to get beyond ourselves and go and proclaim. Now, this isn't all Jews, don't get me wrong. It's a small group. But they have this idea that the message of God has to go beyond them. And also, if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll notice the little guy kneeling down there. Again, there's a small group of Jews that get this as well. What's that a symbol of in these books? Servanthood. So what they also see themselves as is to be a servant people beyond themselves. But don't overemphasize this. This is a small group. But it's a new insight which kind of prepares the way for Jesus and the disciples. So if you turn over a couple of pages, because we don't need to bother about the next page, it's just a summary of what we've already done. But this will help you to see what was happening in the big picture. If you look at the top, these are the empires that exist during the period. So the Assyrians, they've got a fairly big empire. The Babylonian Empire isn't very big, is it? Comparatively. But look at the Persians. Look how big the Persian Empire is. Huge. And then, and this is in the period between the Testaments, the Greeks. Who was the great Greek leader? Alexander. So this is Alexander's empire, which eventually splits into two. Splits into two between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Don't need to worry about it, but basically the problem for Israel is at that time where the split is between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies basically is right over Israel. It's right there. And so that works out well for them, because during the intertestamental period between the two testaments, as the Seleucids and the Ptolemies are kind of fighting each other and weakening, the Jews are able to stand up for themselves, and they actually get a period of independence known as the time of the Maccabees. If you're ever reading the Apocrypha, the bit of the Bible that we don't necessarily have in all our Bibles, there's a whole section of Maccabees 1 and 2. That's the story of the time when Judas Maccabeus and co. threw off for a while the Greek rule and had their own independent state. But then, who comes along next? The Romans. And that then leads us up to and they take the whole thing over again. And that begins to lead us to Jesus. Okay. If you just turn over the page, whoops, what's happening here? I'm going forwards, that's what's happening here. There. This just gives you an idea of how big the kingdom actually ever was. So you can see that in the days of Saul, it's not very big. Tiny. And then you can see how David's became enormous. But then look what happens with Solomon. Solomon, the great wise king, look how much territory he loses. And then, sorry, Christine? He didn't know. And then, this territory, you see the dotted piece is the northern kingdom, because we don't count that. So during the time of Rehoboam, who comes after Solomon, it shrinks even more. During the time that it's a province of Persia, which is during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, see how tiny it is? Now it does have a boost during the time of the Maccabees. And you can see that there. The Hasmoneans. And the Hasmoneans are the family from whom the high priests are drawn in Jesus' day. So we come up to the New Testament. If you turn over the page. So this is where Jesus was. Who was the king when Jesus was born? Which one? None of those on that page. Herod the Great. Herod the Great was the most evil, nasty piece of work that you could ever imagine. He was like Joseph Stalin with bells on. And he was not loved, liked, or anything by his people, and he was the king when Jesus was born. However, he did do a lot of building, which we'll come to in a minute. So, after Herod the Great, what happened was the kingdom was divided, or the area, the region, it's actually a province of Rome, was divided into a number of different regions. And you'll notice at the bottom there's a key down there. So the orange at the top around Galilee and so on, or at least northern Galilee, and there will be names you recognize there like Caesarea Philippi and so on and so forth. That belonged to who? Who was the kind of ruler over that? Philip. The green ones? Herod Antipas. And you see there Capernaum, Gennesaret, places like that. And then the big yellow one is Pontius Pilate. The other interesting thing about this is that you have a number of areas that are just shaded, and they're where the Gentiles lived. So primarily Gentile territory rather than Jewish. So you'll notice, for example, about a third of the way down on the right-hand side, it says the Decapolis. See that? Anyone know what that means? It's a Roman term for? What's a polis? Polis is a city. 10. So it's the 10 towns. The 10 towns. Now, if any of you was awake last week during the service, you will have noticed it during the readings, because the reading last week was the Syrophoenician woman. And so you can, if you look up at the top there, you can see Sidon, Tyre, Phoenicia, yeah? And then what came next was the healing of the deaf mute, yeah? Which it says happened in the Decapolis. Interestingly, it happened in Gentile territory. The guy was probably a Gentile. And the next story, or very soon, is the feeding of the 4,000. Which also happens in the area of the Decapolis among the Gentiles. Jesus is both for the Jew and the Gentile. And he often does parallel healings or parallel miracles. He does one. So we have the feeding of the 5,000 in Jewish territory and the feeding of the 4,000 in Gentile territory. We have a deaf mute healed, or a deaf person healed in Jewish territory and a deaf person healed in Gentile territory. It's the way it works. And so all of these areas are areas that are ruled by different people. You'll notice on